Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. Beastmen are very much the flavour of the month, and Games Workshop very kindly sent me Kralmaw and his little friend ahead of time. So let's get painting.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems and offer custom items to suit your club or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description. A few weeks ago I speed painted a Beastmen army. I'm enjoying adding smaller armies to my collection for playing 500 point games, mostly at home with my son, but it's a really fun way to engage in the game, and it's a really fun way to do small army projects and make videos about how to go about them, and definitely how to save time, which is partly what I do as a day job. I'm an army painter in so many ways. But Games Workshop also send me things. I'm really grateful for that, and they sent me the new Beastmen Brayherds Arcane Journal to review as well, and I'll pop links to both of those videos if you haven't already seen them. But they also sent me the really cool new resin miniature Kralmaw, and it's love it. I love it. It's a really cool little miniature, and he's got his familiar as well, which had lots of theories in the community about who he might be. He's just a familiar, but beautiful miniatures. And this video is going to be about how I painted it. Now, it's a Forge World resin miniature, so that's not Finecast. For any of you that are coming back to Warhammer, remember the days of Finecast miniatures. This is high quality resin, very nicely engineered. It's all 3D design now, goes together pretty easily as well. I'm not going to show you the full building here, but the kits, you do want to read the instructions. You do want to use super glue, and be careful about things like resin dust. Maybe wear a mask if you're doing lots and lots of filing, but building the odd model here and there shouldn't make too much of a difference. Instructions aside are normally quite basic, but they work quite well in most cases, and you should have no troubles at all. And here they both are, all ready and primed black, ready for future layers of paint. But just before we do that, I thought you might like to see a quick size comparison with a regular Gore. So he's a chunky boy, but not outsized for a character in my opinion. But what I'm going to do now is start off with something I do with most of my miniatures, and it's to add a Zenithal layer using my airbrush. Now, I appreciate not everyone has an airbrush or wants to own an airbrush. So if you don't worry too much. I'd recommend a mid-grey prime, and then you can carry on with all of the other things that I'm doing in this video. But I like to slowly build it up so it looks like it's grey to start with, increasing the intensity to white towards the top, mostly top down, so you're capturing a lot of shadows in the recesses underneath, and that really helps if you're building up your layers with glazes, which is what I like to do, especially using contrast paints, because they are technically sort of ready-made glazes in many ways. And I think it's just a really nice way of getting base layers down on a miniature. And if you don't like to do detailed highlighting and things on top, you can have a miniature that's ready to go. I do like to move on a little bit further afterwards, and you'll see that in this video. And the next stage that I like to do is some dry brushing. You can pick any of your favourite whites here, and I'm using a dry palette with a bit of texture on it, which builds up over the time, all the times you do lots of dry brushing. And I'm using some of the newer style that have become fashionable in the last few years, dry brushes, many different brands out there. These ones are actually cheap ones from Amazon, and they're working absolutely fine to me. The board itself is from Knott's Hobbies, including the little sponge there you saw me adding a bit of water to. You can just add a little bit of dampness to your dry brushes before you do it, and it stops them getting quite so chalky. Test it on my hand first, and then while you can, circular motions, but you just want to follow the detail really. And what I'm doing here now is really giving all the detail on the miniature a boost, really picking it out on the edges. So this is the bit that's like the new slap chop. I say new, that video's been out for quite a while. It was an old technique called Gruesome, which is essentially building up textures in grayscale, but it's been used by miniature painters for years. And what we're doing here is creating a surface which is underpainting the miniature, so really enhancing the highlights, leaving the shadows in there, so when you add thin layers of paint, it looks like it's already highlighted and shaded to a certain extent. And that's what you're left with, a nice grayscale miniature, quite light on the highlights. Hard to see on the camera, the white tends to bleach it out a little bit. But we're moving on to a contrast colour first. This is dark oak flesh, and I'm going to be painting that in the small areas of flesh that are visible on this miniature. So it's around his mouth, his ears, his hands, and there's a little bit on his legs. And of course, on the familiar, there's a lot more showing. It's almost a naked body. And what I'm trying to do
here is make sure that there's just the right amount of paint so that it runs into all those recesses, enhancing that shadow that we've already got, because we've left shadow in that miniature with the preparation, the underpainting process, but not so much that it pulls on the flat surfaces, so you're staining the outside of those flat surfaces. And if you take a little bit of time just painting it in rather than slapping it on too thick, then you'll find you get this really nice smooth finish. Now you have to adjust that sometimes depending on the paint. Sometimes the pigment is low and you might need a second coat. Sometimes it's quite thick and you might even need to thin it to get that perfect mix. With this dark oath, as long as I don't put too much on the brush and I'm careful with it, I'm able to get quite a smooth finish, and the effect looks pretty good as it is without going back and doing any highlighting should you not want to. And if you like to get your armies on the table quickly, I think this really is the best way to use any kind of speed paint, be that contrast, army paint, or the Vallejo range. Putting it on like this over a slap chop, or more of an advanced underpainted slap chop with the airbrush as well, like I've done here. You can have really great looking miniatures without needing to highlight, or maybe you'll just do some limited highlights. But on this miniature, we're pretty much going to highlight everything. Now on to the Two Thin Coats paints range, and this is Kronos Flesh and Ares Flesh, and I'm using a little bit of their pale skin as well as a top highlight. This is actually a mid-tone and a highlight from one of their triads, and then the pale skin is a separate, even brighter colour, but it will work for this process. And I'm just picking the next colour along that spectrum that works really well with the base layer contrast that I've done, and a lot of the Two Thin Coats range match really well with Citadel colours. If you look on their website, on the Transatlantic Games website, you'll see there's lots of conversions for Citadel paints as well. So if you're a Citadel paint user, you will find there are almost identical matches for this. You'll be able to go away and convert any of the paints that I show on the screen into Citadel colours, or close enough to it. But essentially what I'm doing here is making sure I'm not completely covering over all that contrast work we've done. I'm just trying to enhance where the highlights are naturally showing over that underpainting, really sort of building up the layers on top of that, cleaning it up, tidying it up, making it pop a little bit more. I've got all those three colours on my wet palette there, so I can slowly build up through the layers, working my way around the miniature, following where that light is showing. As I said, we've already kind of created that artificial light with the underpainting, building up between those three layers, a little bit thinner each time with the highlighting. And essentially this is very traditional, basic layering highlighting that you've been doing for years, very likely. And if you're new to painting, then it's a very standardised technique. As we move towards those final top highlights, you don't need very much at all. So in many cases, you're talking a little bit of a dot on the top of a knuckle or something like that, or a little bit across the bridge of the nose, the end of the nose, across the cheekbone. Not so much in this case, maybe on the bottom of the chin or something, but you're really just trying to show the difference in light from those darker areas right to those lighter areas right at the top. When you've got more of a naked body, like his lovely familiar here, you've got a little bit more work to do. But again, you can just follow the detail of the miniature and let that guide you. Let the underpainting guide you as well. That really shows you where that light is hitting. That's one of the most beneficial things about doing an airbrush Zenithal, if you're able to do it, because it shows you the direction of where the light might hit, and you can almost trace it, follow it along, and colour it in. It definitely makes my painting look a lot better than it would be if I was just painting directly over a flat surface or a black surface where you can't really see where that light is very well, and you're having to build it all up yourself. Right. This is Cygor Brown, one of the first of many earthy colours in this paint job, as you can imagine. It's one of my favourite browns as well. Really rich, lots of reds coming through. And you can highlight it towards a very reddish looking colour, like a red sort of bright leather, but you can also leave it quite dull and look like quite a dark brown as well. It's very versatile depending on what you do with it afterwards. So I've chosen this for the general fur colour of Kralmaw. So I'm painting it in around his legs at the moment. It's lots of furry thighs going on and hair around the bottom of his feet. Also got some hair along his, like a long goatee beard, and the top of his head as well. So it'll take some time just to go around and make sure I fill those in quite neatly if I can, and try not to get the paint too much over to areas that I want to be different colours. And that's one of the drawbacks of doing painting in this style, is to get the best out of it. You want to be as neat as you can, because you get the most out of that underpainting if it's still grayscale or still whitish. Whereas if you overspill too much, you might want to touch that up before you go back and add extra colours. It's not a major problem, but it's something to keep in mind. Back to Two Thin Coats again. This is one of my favourite triads. We have cuirass leather, boar hide and fur cloak, and they group their paints together in triads, which I think is really helpful for choosing colours. Some of us are great at matching colours, some of us aren't so great, and I'm just lazy. And if they can be lined up for me in a little row that says these three complement each other and go from dark to light, then perfect. And most of their triads work really well like that. There's a couple with the odd colour thing, I'm not sure why it's there, but these are pretty good. And these three work perfectly over that contrast paint, just really, really nicely. Now, you could do a little bit of dry brushing here, but there's so much detail on this miniature all over the place, and we want to keep it clean and tidy. Then the best way I found to do this was just to go in with my hairy brush and paint highlights on each individual strand of hair. Now I'm being quite quick with it. I'm not being super neat at this point. This is a tabletop character miniature. So this is army painting for me, but not the super speed paint army painting. This is a character, but this is kind of a 4-hour paint job, not a 12-hour paint job, not even a competition level paint job, but it's 4 hours solid on a character miniature. I want him to stand out and look pretty striking, but if you look at him, you'll be able to see the brush marks. You'll be able to see that he's not done to a competition standard. He's very much something that will draw your eye on the tabletop, but he is for gaming. Much like I did with the skin colours and using the 3 paints there, I'm working my way up. Now, the detail on this miniature is pretty chunky, so those thin strands of hair aren't as thin as they may have been on some of the miniatures from back in the 80s and 90s when they were hand sculpted, and they're very fine. We really did want to dry brush there. But here you can see I'm just mixing some colours together to get an extra stage between them, so they're not quite as bright. That top highlight was a little bit brighter than I wanted it to be. And I'm just layering up, so each of the 4 colours, if we include the contrast, are all going to be visible at some point on the fur. Some of it's left in the shadows, some of it on the larger strands of hair. You might even see the transition between all 4 colours. I'm just building towards the tips of each of those little peaks of the hair to the lightest part at the end, and it lifts it nicely enough. Now, I said there'd be a lot of browns and earthy colours in this paint job, and I'm not lying. This is Gore Grunt of Fur, a much brighter orangey, leathery colour, I would say. And that's going to be my next colour choice here. I'm using the Studio Paint scheme as a guide, trying to match similar kinds of tones, just being lazy again, really, just looking at that paint scheme and saying, yeah, I want to pick something within that region of colour, because it looks great and I've got no reason to sort of go wildly off piece with it. But you could absolutely do it the other way around. You could have gone with his fur with this colour and had all of the robes in a darker colour. The choice is yours with painting miniatures like this, so you know, use what paints you have at hand as well. Sometimes you're limited to what you have. But again, this is a lovely rich colour, applying all the principles that I did earlier, especially with the lighter colours like this for contrast, trying to keep the coats nice and even so they stay in those recesses but don't pull too much on the top, because that really saves you time, and then you're just highlighting on top of that rather than rebase coating and fixing where you have those tide marks. So this is dry brush brown and satyr brown, rather fitting in many ways, and they are the mid and the highlight tone from another triad. I've left out the bottom because it was too close to the base layer with the contrast, so I can skip that stage. You don't need it. Very similar again, using those highlights that are naturally showing because of the prep work, because of that underpainting, and reinforcing them for the first stage for that mid-tone, just making them pop a little bit more, making them stand out. And then I'll go back with that top highlight and just pick out little areas to really make it pop and stand out. And what you end up with is something that looks like a 4 to 5 stage layered highlight on the miniature. Now at this stage I wasn't 100% happy with that top highlight, it didn't pop enough, so I'm using some Manticore Ochre here. I've just mixed that in on the wet palette and just adding the slightest of touches, just where the light really catches, just to make it pop and stand out. And afterwards I was much happier with the transition and it wasn't too dull. It gave it enough definition and contrast between light and dark, as in not contrast the paint. Now this is Garagak Sewer, and it's somewhere in between the previous 2 browns that we've used. It's much more of a neutral brown, a mid-brown if you like. The other 2 colours are both quite warm, one towards the orange, one towards the red. This is a little bit of a cooler brown. Still got enough warmth in it. It's not as cold or as dark as something like Wildwood, which has almost got some black tones to it. This is much more neutral. And if you don't have many contrast paints in your set and you're trying to build them up slowly, this is a really versatile one that can do a lot of things for you, be that belts and boots and cloaks and even fur and things. So very good. I've got them all because I love them so much, and I just find that it's a really enjoyable way of base coating. I could just paint this brown and layer up normally, but you can see the detail shown through. It really helps guide you. And I also find it's a lot quicker to base coat in a contrast paint as well. Mostly really smooth to go on the miniature. You get that first layer down much quicker, which really gets you into the fun part of painting, which is very often the highlighting. Same principles again though here, taking my time to make sure I'm doing it section by section, so you don't end in the middle of a flat area and end up with the tide marks. So try to follow the detail of the miniature. Paint a section so the deepest areas of the recesses are where your brush ends and leaves that sort of wet paint. This is Gizmo, Fur and Manticore Ochre, actually a shade, a base layer and a mid-tone from one of those little triads, and that just fitted on the spectrum of what I needed to go over this paint, really, this contrast paint. Again, thin the paints a little bit on the wet palette so they flow smoothly, and I'm just colouring in here where it looks a little bit lighter on the miniature, making those mid-tone areas a little bit bolder, a little bit less scruffy, because they can in places with contrast paints, especially if you do get a little bit of pooling, which is impossible not to sometimes. Fills it out, tidies it up, and then afterwards build up to that top highlight as well, just picking out the edges, those thinner areas, and your brush strokes get smaller and smaller as you go through the process. Keep that paint thin, keep those layers small, just adding a little bit at a time, building up slowly, and you'll see here you start to build this really nice fabric surface where you've got the really nice dark deep shades of brown in those recesses. But you're really starting to get the highlights to pop and bring some life to that cloak and that fabric, and I think it looks pretty cool. Now this is Contrast Skeleton Horde, and it's something else you can do with contrast paints. Rather than using them as a base layer, a glaze over a Zenithal, you can use them as a more traditional glaze afterwards as well. Some of them you need to thin quite a lot. Low pigment paints like the Skeleton Horde, not as much. And if you think, oh, my highlights look a little bit too stark, a little bit too bright, I can see the transitions between them a little bit too much. You really want to tone them down, flatten them down a little bit. You can glaze back over the top afterwards. Now, in many cases, if you're using contrast paints, the actual base layer that you've used to start with is the perfect colour to do it, but you do need to thin it the right amount to avoid covering over all the nice highlights that you've done here. So playing around with it and getting right is the first layer, first stage really. But you can see how I'm just sort of going with a nice thin coat over all of that cloak, and it's just tying in the top highlights down with the bottom highlights, smoothing it all out, and I think it looks a lot nicer. You won't always want to do this, but it's really, really easy to do. And once you get the hang of it, once you've tried it a couple of times and realise that you haven't wrecked your paint job, then you realise the power of it and how much you can use it to really tidy up your miniatures and make the overall finish look to a higher standard. And you see here as well, it was my next colour. I'm moving on to a lot of the kind of the bandage style wraps and things, and I'm using that as the base colour for those. Likewise on the skulls and things. So this Contrast Skeleton Horde starts becoming the next stage of the miniature. And you can see that here with the familiar. I've not shown an awful lot of what I'm doing with them, but I'm using the same colours and the same techniques. But obviously the whole head's a skull here, and over that Zenithal pre-highlight with the dry brushing, it's perfect. You need a nice layer of Skeleton Horde and it already looks great. Now this is Ambush Yellow and Trooper White, and I'm going to be using this to highlight all of the areas that are fabric that have just gone on in that Skeleton Horde colour. For the bone, I'm going to use a slightly different mix just to differentiate them a little bit, so because we have got bone right next to the fabric sometimes, and I've chosen very similar colours. So I'm just going along here and picking out all the fabric bits but not the bone, and that definition will get a little bit easier to sort of work out later on when we add a few little oil washes and a few little effects. But I'm just going in and really just picking out the detail like we did with the previous layering effects with the paints, but there's less paint here, there's smaller areas, so maybe you don't need always a full triad or even more colours. You can get away with just reinforcing the base colour and then just adding a couple of little dots here to really boost those top highlights. And when you get to highly detailed areas like the wraps around the arms, you've got so much in those recesses. It's surprising how much of an effect just putting a couple of little highlight lines along the tops of them just really makes it pop and stand out. And it's quite striking against all of those darker and duller browns that we've already used. Now Vampire, Fang and White Star for that slightly different white cream spectrum for the bone areas, and the definition for those will grow a little bit more, as I've already said, later on when we add some effects. But right now I just want them to stand out just a touch so I can see the different areas, and then once we add some grime and things later on, they will stand out even more. Now for contrast, Black Templar. This one's a little bit lighter than the Black Legion. It's got some bluer tones to it, which is really good if you want to do things like feathers. When you want to show the edges of the detail a little bit more, this always shows them up. Larger flat areas, this isn't such a great paint because it'll be very, very streaky, lots of tide marks and all of those things. You're much better using Black Legion if you want a real dark black. But for things like this, when you want a bluish tone to it, almost grey, it's perfect. So you've got these areas of feathers hanging down at the top here of his staff, and also on his back he's got some kind of crow that he's strapped to him. I don't know if it's a snack or whether it's for some conjuration later on, but he's got it strapped to his back, and this is just the perfect base layer for it. This is Cold Quartz Blue and Wolf Grey, and I've deliberately picked greys here that have that bluish undertone to them, that sort of heading towards the purple spectrum rather than heading towards the creamer, whiter spectrum. It's deliberate. Obviously we've used a black that has that kind of undertone to it as well. So what you're more likely to end up with is a glossy, shiny black, the way that a feather might be, rather than something dull and dirty. And all I'm doing here is just following along the edge of some of those feather highlights. You could dry brush these maybe very gently. I'm more running the brush along the edge of the highlights and doing a few little lines in picking up some of that detail. I'm making no attempt to pick up every single strand on these feathers. As I said before, this is a nice standard character miniature for a tabletop army. I'm not trying to win any awards here. I'm trying to make a painting video that doesn't take me 2 days as well. So I am cutting a few corners when I army paint like this, but I feel that's the way a lot of people paint anyway to get their gaming armies on the table, and I want to represent that in the videos that I put on the channel. And after both of those highlight layers are done, I've actually turned to some Pterodon Turquoise, which is a bluey greeny contrast colour, just adding a little bit of water on my wet palette and doing a very, very thin glaze over all of the feathered areas. It just ties these up a little bit, takes the edge off some of those highlights, but gives it that nice blue strong tone to it as well, makes it look a little bit shiny. So we have a few paints here. I've got Skeleton Horde, I've got Wildwood, I've got Sigil Brown, and I've got some green as well. Now, the idea of this is to wet blend these on the wooden areas. This has been covered ad nauseum on the channel and my method of doing wood over an underpainted miniature, and I'm not going to go into a long diatribe about why I do it, other than to say that it looks cool and it's easy. If you want to know more about my thought processes of doing this on a larger area of wood, go and watch a recent Tree Man tutorial. That's kind of pushing it to the extreme, but look at any of the tutorials that I've done when there's something wood in there, like the landship has lots of this chatter on there as well about how you can paint wood to look really cool and really effective just using contrast paints. But essentially all I'm going to explain here is that I've got those paints on the wet palette. They've had a touch of water added to them all apart from the contrast Skeleton Horde, and I pick patches on the wooden area while the paints are still wet and mix them together literally on the model, the wet blending side, and it gives you different shades and tones and variations throughout the wood. In a semi-similar vein here, we have Contrast Skeleton Horde, Agaras Dunes and Wildwood, and it's a really quick way of doing horns on things rather than doing the usual sort of building up layers and painting to a point. I'm starting from one colour, one end. It only really works over a detailed miniature like this when you've got lots of dry brushing, and I've already picked out some of the ridges of a lighter colour, but then I'm mixing in the Agaras Dunes, which is a slightly yellower colour, so I'm wet blending that together with the Skeleton Horde, and as we get towards the tip of the horn, I'm wet blending in the Wildwood as well, so that mixes and runs in with the previous colour, so you get this really smooth, natural looking transition from a lighter, fresh growth through to something that's a little bit darker. Now someone's going to put in the comments that it should be dark to light or something like that. You can do it both ways. I don't really care either way, but it looks right, it looks pretty cool, and it's such an easy way to do it. Now you can go back and do extra highlights on afterwards, but again, if you're looking to do it quickly, that's a really good way of doing it. So this is Mantis Warriors Green and Guilliman Flesh. It's going to be what I use for the severed head and the hand that are hanging from his staff. Going with the Guilliman Flesh first. Nice thin layer, as I mentioned before, really making sure that I'm not got any pooling on there. Really letting all that underpainting do its job, do its work. If you've got a flat white, it doesn't work quite as well. You need those shadows in there to really get the most out of that process. And then afterwards, to go back with the Mantis Warriors Green, which is quite low in pigment out of all the greens they do and quite bright, but if you put a thin layer on, it'll just add a sickly hue, and I imagine if you've had your head removed, you would be quite sick. And I think it just does enough to make it look a little bit grim and disgusting and dead, which was the most important thing. Keep it looking gruesome and all. This is Shyish Purple and Vulpus Pink, and if you watch the channel a lot, you'll have seen me use these colours or colours like this as part of my skin recipes. I deliberately left it off doing this when I did the skin stages earlier on. I wanted to see the balance of the overall miniature before I decided how much of these colours I wanted to go back and put in. And now I'm going to do that. So the purple is a colder colour, obviously, and it adds a little bit of shadow. It's really good around sort of wristband, in the area where the skin is meeting clothing where there would be some shadow. And then the red just adds a little bit of brighter colour, a little bit of life, a little bit of volume in there. And I'm glazing in very thin here. They're on the wet palette, and I'm just off camera because my camera doesn't have a great macro lens, so I have to zoom in post filming a little bit, so you don't always get to see my palette. But I'm just glazing it over the knee here a little bit, nice thin layers, then blending it out with a clean brush as well, so we don't get any pooling. Just adds a little bit of interest, a little bit of extra colour, and a little bit of variation to the skin. Now this is Soulstone Blue technical paint. I thinned a little bit on the wet palette, and I'm just painting it in over the eyes, which are underpainted with a bright white dot as well, and just allowing it to blend out a little bit onto the cheekbones to give it that glowing effect. You can do that with a lot of different contrast paints. This has a nice glossy finish afterwards, so it's really nice to do it all in one go. Now, there's hardly any metallics on this miniature. Of course not, it's a Beastman, but we have bits of tin, overlord brass and top brass here, just 3 layers. The base layer, the bits of tin, is a very brown metallic, and it's really simple to just to slowly build up from that darker brown to that sort of lighter brass colour where the light is hitting, where the brass has been brushed or touched and things. And I think they're essentially just cowbells, or it looks like cowbells. Nothing groundbreaking here at all anyway. We've got 3 colours. Very much standard layering, highlighting on a very small amount of metallics on the miniature. Socote Silver and Mithril Blade here. There's a hook on the back with all his little dangly things, and I've used the bits of tin as the base layer for that anyway. Then the Socote Silver and a little touch of highlight with the Mithril Blade on top, and that's all it really needs. Returning to some of those greys from earlier, with the Colcott's Blue and the Wolf Grey, and then the top highlight, the Greystone Blue as well. And that it really is just to handle this little bit of stone that he's got tied into his beard like a big stone medallion going on. I haven't really touched that yet. So just 3-layer highlighting here. Because of all the other colours that have gone on, it's not been left grey. It's got a little bit of brown on there, so I'm just painting in as standard. So the grey first, then the mid-tone, and then the highlight. I'm not going to go into any detail about how I did it, other than there's a little bit of sort of runic marking on the front, and I'm just trying to catch the edges of that with the top highlight a little bit, because we're going to add a little effect in a minute, and that'll just help that pop out a little bit more. And that effect is a little bit more of that Soulstone Blue, just thin on the wet palette and just lightly glazed over the top of it to give it a really simple glowing effect without spending lots of time doing it. I'm going to be using the snow sprinkles from AK just to match in with the Beastman army I've already done, and these are some of the other effects as well, some mud effects, some blood for the blood god, and a little bit of black to mix in with the blood to make it look a bit darker. But I'm not showing you the full basing tutorial here. I'll try and remember now to pop a link into a recent video I did on basing and all the details that I do around that, all the different effects that I use. They're really, really simple. Involves buying a bit of kit, but once you've got it, it lasts for ages, and you can get some really cool looking bases without having to spend ages on them. But this is just a great way here, adding a little mud effect around the bottom of the cloak, just to really add some character. Works perfectly with these really dark, grimy armies like Beastmen. The snow effect just goes on in little patches here. I want it to look like thawing snow, so on the tufts of grass is a really nice way of doing it. The ground that's not walked on quite as much, a little patch here and there, and then while they're wet, they take blood effect really nicely as well, so it looks like the blood's just running into the snow. It's always fun to do. And I've got a little bit of a mix of the blood for the blood god with a little bit of the black contrast in there as well, just to darken it down for where the blood is old and dried, and then I can just put that on the severed head and hand as well in places, just to make it look even more grim and horrible. Though I do add a little bit of flesh blood onto the right hand, and like I've already mentioned, onto a little patch of snow on the base as well. But after finishing off the base edge to tidy it all up, and I always like to go black, they are done. But let's have a look at some proper pictures, and I can talk you through and give you a few final thoughts on them. There's some parts I've not covered because I'm painting 2 miniatures and trying to keep the video under half an hour. So if you'd like to know how I did the mushrooms on the sort of the tree stump that the familiar is sitting on, I send you to that video about painting the tree men that I've done recently, and that will also give you all the information around my theories of painting wood using contrast paints over the Zenithal. I think it's really useful, and you can get nice effects very, very easily. These are beautiful sculpts, really lovely miniatures that went together really well. So from a review point of view, they are great, really, really nice. And it's so characterful. The rules are really good for him as well. I think with his 4-up ward save, which you don't get anyway in the Beastmen army, and with his magical abilities, I think he's going to be popular, and we'll probably see him a lot on the table. But really enjoyed painting the miniature. Really glad to spend a little bit more time on a Beastman rather than all the corners I cut doing that speed paint video. That's not always the way I paint. This is a bit more of a standard way that I'll approach a character for a gaming army, and it's just a great miniature packed full of detail that you can have loads and loads of fun with. As you haven't already got him and you're tempted, I definitely recommend the miniature. It's really, really cool, and thank you very much to Games Workshop for sending it out to me. But let me know what you think of him in the comments anyway, and what you're building for your own Beastmen armies. I'd love to hear what you're collecting and painting at the moment.
Well, thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much Games Workshop for sending me the miniature ahead of time. Lots of fun doing that, and a slightly different style as well to the army paint, slightly less fast than the army paint that I did in a previous video. So I hope you've enjoyed the video and enjoyed listening to me rabbit on about Warhammer the Old World, one of my favourite topics. If you have, please do comment below, give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. If you'd like to support me even further, please do check out my Patreon. It really is one of the best ways that you can support me to continue to make videos like this and make more videos like this, because it takes a lot of time to film and edit and all the other things that go around running a channel. I'd love to make more videos and make more content for you. The only way I can do that really is through financial support. If you can't afford to do that or don't want to do that, it's equally cool as well. I will continue to make videos, so I'm not going to be going anywhere, but I really appreciate it if you can support me. There are lots of other links in that video description as well, including one to Counterattack Bases, which is the channel sponsor, and they're a small business, so go and give them some love as well. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.